The ground, it came up fast, harder than I expected. The earth felt cold, unyielding against my cheek. Dust rose around me, soft at first, then choking. For a moment I couldn't move. The weight of my armor pinned me down, pressing me further into the dirt. Above, the sky stretched wide, its gray expanse empty, unfeeling. The battlefield had gone silent. The clanging of swords, the roars of soldiers, the rhythmic stomp of marching feet, all of it vanished. Even the wind, which had carried the war cries across the valley, still as if holding its breath. It was not the sound of peace, it was the sound of disbelief. I felt their stares from the hills where the Israelites gathered, from the ranks of my men who had chanted my name just moments before. Their eyes burned into me, heavy and relentless. I was Goliath, the undefeated, the feared. How could I be lying here, felled by a single stone? My hand twitched, seeking the hilt of my sword, but the weight of failure pressed harder than my armor. This was no mere defeat, it was an unraveling. The image they had built of me, the invincible Goliath, was shattering. And as I lay there, with the world watching, I realized something. I had been falling long before this moment. This is not where my story begins. To understand the fall, you must first understand the weight I carried. The weight of their expectations, the burden of being the giant. They always said I was destined for greatness. Look at his size, they'd whisper. He'll lead us to victory. I heard it before I could walk. Their words were loud, relentless, and heavier than any sword I would later carry. I grew quickly, taller, stronger, faster than the other boys. My father noticed first. He watched me the way a smith watches a blade being forged, waiting for the moment it could cut. Goliath, he said, you will be a warrior. But his tone wasn't prideful, it was demanding. It wasn't a choice, it was a decree. My training began at dawn, the sky still streaked with the red glow of sunrise. The clang of wooden swords echoed through the yard as I parried and struck, again and again. My hands bled, my arms ached, but the training didn't stop. A giant doesn't rest, my father would say. His voice was sharp, cutting through my exhaustion. Years passed, and the boy who once longed for a day off became the man they feared. My name became a chant that filled the air. Goliath! Goliath! They cheered for me before I even stepped onto the battlefield. But their cheers weren't for me. They were for the idea of me. The invincible, the unstoppable, the giant. I wore their expectations like armor, heavy and suffocating. Every swing of my sword, every victory added to their belief. But the more they believed, the less I could breathe. My victories piled up, but so did my doubts. Each battle ended the same, with me standing over another fallen foe, the crowd roaring in triumph. And yet, when I looked at their faces, I didn't see joy. I saw hunger. Hunger for the next fight, the next victory. The next proof was that Goliath was everything they thought he was. But beneath the armor, I was still just a man. A man who carried their hopes, their fears, their demands. And as the victories mounted, so did the weight. Because deep down I knew, no giant can stand forever. He walked toward me, not with the stride of a warrior, but with the calm of someone who knew exactly why he was there. His sandals kicked up small clouds of dust with every step. The sling dangled loosely from his hand, swaying gently against his side. No sword, no shield, no armor, just a boy, a shepherd. From where I stood, he looked like a shadow against the vastness of the battlefield. Small, fragile, and yet his movements were steady, purposeful. He didn't falter. He didn't hesitate. It was as if he couldn't even see the giant standing before him. I watched him closely, searching for the fear I had seen in so many before him. There was none. His eyes, clear and unflinching, met mine. They didn't burn with rage or defiance. They burned with something else. Faith. The Philistines behind me laughed, their jeers echoing across the valley. "Is this who they send to fight us?" one of them shouted. I heard the chuckles ripple through my men, but they sounded hollow to me. The Israelites on the other side were silent. Even they didn't seem to believe in him. I called out to him, my voice booming. "Why do you come against me, boy? Do you think you can defeat Goliath?" My words rolled across the valley, but he didn't flinch. He stopped, planted his feet firmly on the ground, and raised his voice, not to match mine, but to carry above it. "You come to me with sword and spear," he said, "but I come to you in the name of the Lord Almighty." The words hung in the air, heavy and unshakable. They struck something within me. It wasn't anger, it wasn't fear. It was unease. This boy wasn't like the others. He didn't carry armor, but he carried something far greater. As he reached into his pouch and pulled out a stone, the air around us seemed to be still. The laughter faded. The valley held its breath. My grip tightened on my spear as I watched him load the sling, his movements deliberate, practiced. For the first time in my life, I felt the weight of my own size, my own strength, and wondered if it would be enough. The valley seemed to hold its breath. No wind stirred, no birds sang. Even the soldiers who had cheered and jeered moments ago fell silent. It was as if the world itself knew what was about to happen. Two figures stood alone in the center of it all, a boy with a sling and a giant with a spear. The weight of my armor pressed against my shoulders, heavier than it had ever felt before. My spear, balanced and deadly, now seemed unwieldy in my grip. Across the distance, I watched him, a boy, steady as stone, his hands working with quiet precision as he loaded his sling. I took a step forward, my boots crunching against the dry earth. The sound seemed deafening in the silence. Each step brought me closer to him, but it also brought me closer to something I couldn't quite name. Doubt? Fear? No, it wasn't fear. Not yet, but it was something. Behind me, the Philistines murmured, their voices low and uncertain. They had seen me crush men twice his size, warriors with armor and swords that could cleave through shields. But this boy, he carried no sword, no shield, only a sling and a stone. And yet there was a stillness about him, a calm that unsettled even the most hardened among us. "Come closer," I called to him, my voice a thunderclap that echoed off the valley walls. "Let me feed your flesh to the birds and beasts." The words left my mouth with the force of a battle cry, but they felt hollow. They were meant to intimidate, to break his resolve, but his face remained unchanged. He stopped, his sandals kicking up a small puff of dust. "You come to me with sword and spear," he said, his voice calm but steady, "but I come to you in the name of the Lord Almighty." His words weren't loud, but they carried. They filled the space between us, settling into my chest like a weight I couldn't shake. My grip on the spear tightened. It wasn't anger that drove me forward, it was instinct. A need to end this, to silence the unease that had taken root. I charged, my steps heavy and deliberate. The ground beneath me trembled, each stride pounding like the heartbeat of the earth itself. But as I raised my spear, something stopped me. It wasn't a physical force, it was the look in his eyes, unwavering, certain. There was no hesitation, no fear, only faith. And then it came, a whistle through the air, sharp and cutting. I felt it before I saw it. The stone, small and insignificant, striking with the force of a mountain. Pain exploded in my skull, blinding, consuming. My knees buckled, the earth rushing up to meet me. The valley erupted in sound, cheers, cries, gasps, but they felt distant, muted. As I fell, my vision blurred, the boy's figure standing tall above me, still and resolute. The last thing I saw was not his sling, not his stone, but his eyes, burning with a faith that could move mountains. And in that moment, as the earth swallowed me whole, I realized this was never about strength. It was never about size or skill. This was a battle of wills, his faith against my doubt. And faith had won. The battlefield was alive with sound again. But it wasn't the sound of battle. It was something else. Cheers erupted from the Israelite ranks, their voices rising like a storm sweeping through the valley. On the other side, my own men stood frozen, their weapons slack in their hands. Some began to retreat, their footsteps hesitant and disbelieving. Others simply stared, their faces pale with shock. I lay motionless, my body pinned by the weight of my armor and something heavier, failure. The cold earth beneath me pressed into my skin, but it was the weight in my chest that I couldn't escape. My vision blurred, and through the haze, I saw him, David. He stood where I had once towered, his figure small but unshakable. The boy who had felled a giant. Above me, the sky was vast and uncaring, its gray expanse indifferent to my fall. Around me, the battlefield was a picture of chaos. The Philistines, who moments ago had chanted my name with confidence, now scrambled to retreat. Their voices, once filled with bravado, were now tinged with fear. The Israelites surged forward, their shouts of triumph echoing off the valley walls. I wanted to rise, to stand and face them one last time, but my body betrayed me. My limbs refused to move, and the sharp sting in my head reminded me of the stone that had brought me down. It wasn't just my body that was broken, it was the image of who I was. Goliath, the invincible, was no more. David moved closer, his sandals stirring the dust with every step. In his hand, the sling hung loosely, like a tool no longer needed. His face wasn't one of triumph, but of calm resolve. He looked at me, not with hatred, not with pity, but with certainty, the kind of certainty I had never known. Behind him, the Israelites began to chant his name. "David! David!" Their voices were loud, almost deafening, but he didn't react. His eyes remained on me, steady and unwavering. For a moment, I thought I saw something there. Understanding? Compassion? I didn't know. The battlefield shifted around me. Philistine banners fell as their soldiers retreated. The Israelites moved forward, seizing ground they had feared to tread only moments ago. And in the midst of it all, I remained, silent, unmoving, a monument to defeat. As the sounds of the valley grew distant, my thoughts turned inward. This wasn't just the end of a battle. It was the end of something greater. The end of Goliath. And in the silence of my own mind, a single thought lingered. The giant had fallen, but the boy had risen. I thought strength was everything. My size, my power, my victories, they were what defined me. Or so I believed. Lying on the cold ground, my body broken, I began to understand how wrong I had been. David didn't defeat me with strength. He didn't need it. What he had, what I could never comprehend, was faith. Unshakable, unwavering faith. It wasn't his sling that felled me, nor the stone. It was the certainty in his heart, a force greater than any weapon I had ever faced. The sky above seemed endless, a gray expanse that mirrored the emptiness I felt inside. For years, I had carried the weight of expectations, the belief that I was invincible. But that weight had been hollow. I had strength but no purpose, power but no foundation. David, on the other hand, stood with nothing but his faith, and it had been enough. I began to see the battle differently. It wasn't just a clash between two figures, it was a confrontation between two forces. My arrogance against his humility, my doubts are against his belief. And in every way that mattered, he was stronger. I had mocked him when he first stepped onto the battlefield. Why send a boy to face a giant? I sneered. But now I realized the truth. David wasn't the weaker one. I was. He stood firm because he trusted in something beyond himself, while I had relied solely on what I could see and touch. My armor, my sword, my spear, they were all meaningless against the invisible power he carried. The sounds of the battlefield had faded, leaving me alone with my thoughts. I replayed the moment in my mind, the stone leaving his sling, cutting through the air with the precision of a divine hand. It had struck me not just in the head, but in the soul. It shattered more than my body. It shattered my pride, my assumptions, my certainty. For the first time, I saw myself clearly, not as the giant, not as the warrior they had cheered for, but as a man. A flawed, fragile man who had built his life on a foundation of sand. And as I lay there, staring up at the vastness of the sky, I began to wonder, what would it have been like to believe in something greater than myself? David's victory wasn't just his own. It was a victory of faith over fear, of humility over arrogance. And as the shadows of the valley lengthened, I realized that while I had fallen, something far greater had risen. The boy with a sling had shown me what true strength looked like, not in muscle or steel, but in the quiet, steady power of belief. The battlefield was quiet now, the dust settling over the valley like a shroud. The Philistines had fled, their banners abandoned in the chaos of retreat. The Israelites stood victorious, their cheers echoing through the hills. And at the center of it all was David. He stood small but unshakable, his sling now tucked away, his hand resting lightly on the hilt of a sword far too large for him. It was my sword. The weight of it didn't seem to faze him, as if even that burden was something he could bear with ease. He wasn't just a boy anymore. In the eyes of those who watched, he had become something far greater, a leader, a symbol, a hero. As for me, I was nothing more than a memory now. Goliath, the invincible, was gone. The name that once struck fear into armies would now serve as a cautionary tale. I wasn't the giant anymore. I was the lesson. Word of the battle spread quickly. Villages whispered of the shepherd boy who had faced the Philistine giant and won. Songs were sung, recounting the moment the stone flew and the giant fell. But they didn't sing of my strength or my victories. They sang of my fall, of David's rise. I could see it in their faces as they watched him ascend the hill to join his people. They no longer looked at him with doubt or pity. They looked at him with hope. He was the one they had been waiting for, the one who would lead them. And though I had once towered over him, I now seemed so small in comparison. But my story didn't end there. Though my body lay broken, my defeat became something more. A warning to those who might follow in my footsteps. To those who would put their faith in steel and strength alone. My fall was not just a failure. It was a reminder of what happens when pride blinds us to what truly matters. David's story, however, was just beginning. The shepherd boy who had stood against me would go on to become a king. His name would be remembered not just for the sling and the stone, but for the strength of his faith and the wisdom of his rule. He had shown the world that giants fall, and that sometimes the smallest among us carry the greatest power. And so the battlefield became more than a place of victory. It became a symbol of transformation. For David, it marked the start of his rise. For me, it marked the end of an era. And for those who heard our story, it became a reminder. A giant is not defeated by strength, but by belief. The boy with the sling had won, but more than that, his faith had triumphed over my fear. And though my name would fade, his would endure. David the shepherd, David the king, David the slayer of giants.